All right, welcome to your personalized deep dive. Looks like we're going deep on cannabis storage today.
That's right.
Yeah, we've got your notes and articles here, and wow, there's a lot more to this than I realized.
It really is fascinating how much goes into keeping cannabis fresh.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You spend all this time thinking about how you're going to consume it, but not how to keep it good before you do.
Exactly.
So let's get into it. I guess the first thing is that, those buds don't just stay the same forever after harvest.
No, they definitely change over time.
Yeah, like they're still basically alive, right?
Well, right. Even after harvest, cannabis is still a dynamic, living product. It's
Okay.
constantly changing. Its chemical composition is changing over time.
Hmm.
Think of it like an apple or something. It starts to brown and lose its flavor after it's been picked. Cannabis is kind of similar.
Right, right.
Except, of course, with cannabis, we're worried about those precious cannabinoids and terpenes degrading.
Yeah, those are what we're really after. So we're fighting against time, essentially. What are the biggest threats we're trying to protect it from?
Well, probably the biggest one is oxidation.
Okay.
Air exposure is really a constant threat because it causes the THC molecules to transform into CBN, which has a much milder, almost sedative effect.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it like wine. You wouldn't leave a fine wine open to the air.
No, definitely not.
Same principle.
All right, so airtight storage is crucial.
Yes.
What else do we have to watch out for?
Another big factor is light, especially UV rays.
Hmm.
They act like a bleaching agent, and they break down those cannabinoids and terpenes,
Yeah, I can see that.
like how the sun can fade colors.
Right.
Same kind of process.
Okay, so airtight and dark.
Yeah.
What about temperature? Does it have like a Goldilocks zone like some houseplants?
It does. It absolutely does. Temperature fluctuations can really speed up the degradation.
Okay.
So you ideally want to aim for a pretty consistent temperature between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically, comfortable room temperature, if you're comfortable, your cannabis is probably comfortable.
Okay, so don't put it up in a hot attic or down in a cold basement.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And while we're talking about delicate things, we can't forget about humidity.
Right.
Too dry and your buds get all brittle and harsh.
Yeah, I've seen that happening.
Too humid and you're inviting mold, which you definitely don't want to be inhaling.
No, for sure not. So humidity is important too.
Yeah, maintaining a relative humidity of between 59 and 63% is ideal.
Okay. And how do you manage that?
Well, luckily, there are these things called humidity control packs. Your sources mentioned those.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those.
They're like little climate control systems for your storage.
So you just toss them in with your cannabis.
Yes.
Smart.
Yeah.
All right. Well, speaking of, containers seem like a big deal.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's talk about the ideal storage container.
All your sources really seem to emphasize airtight glass jars.
Right. Glass makes sense.
Yeah, it's non-reactive, so it won't mess with the flavor or anything.
Okay, but one of your sources actually went deeper and recommended like opaque or amber glass over clear glass.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
Even small amounts of light exposure can affect it over time.
Okay.
And the opaque or amber glass blocks out those harmful UV rays a bit more.
So give it its own little dark room.
Exactly.
Make sense? Airtight, dark glass jars.
Yep.
All right, so far so good. Now, one of your sources threw in a bit of a curveball and talked about vacuum sealing.
Oh, yeah.
What's the deal with that?
Well, vacuum sealing takes it to the next level as far as preserving freshness goes.
Okay.
It removes basically all the oxygen, which we know is a big problem for cannabinoids and terpenes.
Right, right.
So it's not just storage, it's like putting them in a time capsule.
Interesting. Are there any downsides?
Well, first of all, your cannabis has to be completely dry before you seal it up.
Okay.
Any moisture at all. And you're risking mold, which can really flourish in an airtight environment.
So make sure it's bone dry first.
Yeah. And another thing to keep in mind is that vacuum sealing can actually change how the buds look.
Hmm.
They might end up, flattened or compressed, which some people don't like the look of.
So it's a choice between looks and preservation.
Kind of. It depends on what you're after, really.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
All right, so vacuum sealing, that's a whole other thing to explore.
it is.
But before we go full science lab, let's get back to the basics.
Okay.
We've talked about ideal storage, but how do you even know when things have gone bad? Like, how can you tell if it's past its prime?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
It's really all about being able to spot those subtle signs that it's starting to degrade.
So you got to become like a cannabis detective.
Exactly. And luckily, your sources gave us the tools we need.
Okay, good.
One of the first things you'll notice is the color. Fresh cannabis should have those bright green hues.
Hmm.
If you see browning or fading, that's a sign that oxidation is happening.
Right, so like an apple browning.
Exactly. And then the texture. Fresh buds, should be a bit sticky and resinous thanks to the trichomes.
Yeah,
If it feels dry, crumbly, lost its stickiness, that's another bad sign.
that makes sense.
And speaking of, the aroma is a big one too.
Hmm.
Fresh cannabis has that potent fragrance thanks to all those terpenes.
Great.
If that smell is weak or it's got a stale odor, it means the terpenes have degraded.
Yeah, so you're losing the good stuff.
You are, and if you find yourself needing more than usual to get the same effect, that's also a sign it might be past its prime.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's like a faded photograph. It's still there, but it's not as vibrant.
All right, so we've got color, texture, smell.
Yeah.
What's like the absolute worst case scenario?
Mold. If you see any signs of mold, it's game over.
Yeah, it's got to be it.
Yeah, it's a sign that something went wrong with the storage, and you definitely don't want to be consuming moldy cannabis.
No, absolutely not.
So yeah, toss it out if you see any mold.
Okay, good advice. So to sum all this up, the key to preserving cannabis is really controlling these four elements: air, light, temperature, and humidity.
Exactly.
And by using the right containers, keeping it in the dark, and managing the temperature and humidity, you can keep it good for much longer.
You can. It's like you become a curator for your cannabis, You're preserving something valuable.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But, something occurred to me as we were talking.
Mm-hmm.
All this is about storing whole buds. What about ground cannabis?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, how does that change things?
Well, grinding it obviously increases the surface area exposed to air, which is not good.
Right.
So yeah, it can speed up that oxidation process.
So do the same rules apply, or does it need something different?
Honestly, your sources didn't really get into that.
Huh. So that's a whole other question then.
It is.
Yeah, maybe our listener can experiment and figure it out.
That would be interesting.
All right, well, speaking of experimenting, let's dive into some of the more advanced storage stuff.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, we touched on vacuum sealing, but there's all sorts of really high-tech stuff out there.
There is, yeah.
So we'll get into all of that after the break.
Sounds good.
All right, so we've covered the basics, airtight containers, darkness, cool temps, humidity control.
Yeah.
We're practically like, what, cannabis storage ninjas now?
Right. But your sources, they hint at some even more sophisticated techniques, like something called nitrogen sealing. Have you ever heard of that?
Honestly, it sounds kind of sci-fi to me. What is that?
It's actually a technique that comes from the food industry.
Okay.
Nitrogen is what's called an inert gas, which basically means it doesn't really react with other elements.
Okay.
So if you replace all the oxygen in a container with nitrogen, you basically create this ultra protective environment that really slows down oxidation.
Wow. So it's like a little oxygen-free bubble around your cannabis.
Exactly. It's super effective for long-term storage.
Yeah.
One of your sources even said it can preserve, the cannabinoids and terpenes for years with almost no degradation.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. But I'm guessing this isn't something you can just do at home with a Ziploc bag.
Huh. No, it takes special equipment.
Right.
It's usually done by commercial growers or dispensaries.
Okay, that makes sense, but it's interesting that that level of preservation is even possible.
It is.
What other high-tech techniques did you find?
One of them mentioned a humidity-controlled curing chamber. Have you heard of those?
That one rings a bell, but I don't really know what it is.
It's basically like a climate-controlled room that's specifically for, curing and storing cannabis.
Okay.
So you can, precisely control the temperature and humidity.
Right.
And it creates the perfect conditions for the cannabinoids and terpenes to mature and stabilize.
So like a high-tech greenhouse, but for after harvest.
Exactly.
I see.
Yeah. And it can really make a big difference when it comes to preserving quality. Traditional curing often relies on guesswork and the weather and stuff. But with these chambers, you take all that variability out of it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you get consistent, optimal results.
That's pretty cool, but I bet it's expensive.
It can be, yeah. It's usually something that bigger growers use.
Right, if you're really serious about it.
Yeah.
It's cool that it even exists, though.
It is.
There's this whole world of, secret cannabis preservation techniques out there.
Ah.
Okay, so we talked about the high-tech stuff, but let's be real, most people aren't going to be buying nitrogen tanks.
Yeah.
What are some things you can do that are a little more, accessible?
Well, one thing you can do is just invest in some good quality humidity control packs.
Oh, yeah, those things we were talking about.
Yeah, they're not that expensive, and they really help maintain that ideal humidity range.
Right.
So it prevents your buds from getting too dry or too moist.
Okay, that's a pretty easy upgrade.
It is. Another thing is to be mindful of the size of your containers.
Hmm.
You don't want to use like a giant jar for just a little bit of cannabis
All
because
right.
you'll have all this extra airspace, which, increases the risk of oxidation.
So it's like Goldilocks, find the jar that's just right.
Exactly. Minimize that airspace and you're doing good.
Okay, good tip. But, while we're talking about all this, I'm wondering, does it really make that big of a difference? Like,
Mhm.
is perfectly stored cannabis really that much better than just, throwing it in a drawer for a few months?
Oh, it absolutely makes a difference. You really notice it in the aroma, the flavor, even the effects.
Hmm.
It's hard to describe. You kind of have to experience it.
Okay, well, give it a shot. What's the
Right.
difference between, a well-preserved bud and one that's been neglected?
Okay, imagine this. You open up a jar of perfectly stored cannabis and, you immediately get hit with this like wave of aroma.
Okay.
It's complex and nuanced and, it's alive. The terpenes are doing their thing. And the buds themselves, they're sticky, they're vibrant. They've got that nice coating of trichomes.
Uh-huh.
And when you smoke it, the flavor is smooth and, full and the effects are potent and clear.
I like the sound of that. Now, what about the neglected bud?
Well, instead of that, nice aroma, you might get something kind of stale or musty.
Okay.
The buds themselves might be, dry and crumbly and they've lost that stickiness.
Right.
And when you smoke it, the flavor might be harsh or muted,
Mm.
and the effects might be weaker or just not as pleasant.
Wow, yeah, that's a big difference.
It is. You're really preserving the whole experience.
Right, not just making it last longer.
Exactly. It's about honoring the plant.
Okay, I'm convinced I'm going to step up my storage game.
Good.
But, going through these sources, it seems like they're all focused on storing the cannabis you buy. What about, before it gets to you?
That's a great point. We often forget about the whole journey it takes before it ends up in our hands.
Right, so like you focus on the last mile of a marathon, but there's a whole race before that.
Yeah, and how it's handled all along the way makes a big difference.
So we're talking about like growing, drying, curing, packaging, transporting,
All of it, yeah. Every step can affect the quality.
and we don't always know what happened, right?
No, not always. So it's good to be an informed consumer.
So how do we do that?
Well, whenever you can, try to learn about the grower or the dispensary.
Hmm.
Look for people who use sustainable practices, organic methods. Those things often mean better quality.
Makes sense.
And, pay attention when you get your cannabis. Look at the packaging.
Right.
Was it sealed properly? Were there any humidity control measures? Those little things can tell you a lot.
So you can tell a lot before you even open it.
Yeah, you can.
Interesting. So we can be smart about what we buy and how we store it.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. But, all this stuff about storage techniques and humidity and terpenes, it can get a little overwhelming.
I know what you mean.
Like, where do you even start?
Just start with the basics.
Sure.
Air, light, temperature, humidity. Get yourself some good airtight containers. Find a cool, dark place. Maybe get some of those humidity control packs.
All right. Good starting points.
Yeah. And then from there, just pay attention, experiment a little, see how things change over time.
You learn as you go.
You do. It's like you develop this intuition for what works best.
It's like you become a cannabis sommelier or something.
Right.
All right, but before we wrap up,
Yeah.
one of your sources brought up something that I thought was really interesting.
Oh, yeah?
It asked, what if we're thinking about storage all wrong? Like, what if instead of trying to preserve what we have, we should be focused on preserving what we want to have?
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, I'm hooked. What does that even mean?
It's about shifting from, passive storage to active curation. Like imagine being able to pick specific strains with the cannabinoids and terpenes that you want,
Okay.
and then using these advanced techniques to like lock those qualities in.
So instead of just slowing down the bad stuff, you're controlling how it changes.
Exactly. You become like a cannabis alchemist or something.
That is pretty wild. How would you even do that?
Well, it takes a lot of knowledge.
Oh,
You have
okay.
to really understand the genetics, the science of cannabinoids and terpenes,
Yeah,
and how storage affects all of that.
that sounds pretty intense.
It is, but the possibilities are exciting.
They are. But for now, I think we'll stick to the basics.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've gone from the science of degradation to high-tech storage to even like the philosophy of cannabis preservation.
We have, yeah.
It's been a pretty wild ride.
It has.
And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you learned something and that you're feeling, inspired to take your cannabis storage to the next level.
Yeah, definitely.
Remember, it's not just about, preserving the product. It's about preserving the experience.
Well said.
All right, until next time.
Happy storing.
It's pretty amazing, this idea of like curating your cannabis.
It is, yeah. It's like instead of just being, a caretaker,
Yeah.
you're kind of, shaping its destiny a little bit.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you said, this is maybe where things are headed.
I think so.
Like as we learn more about this stuff,
Yeah.
we'll be able to like create these really specific experiences.
Right, because as we understand more about, cannabinoids and terpenes and how they, react to different storage conditions,
Right.
we can really use that to, create something very specific.
So it's not just about like preventing it from going bad. You're actually like guiding it in a certain direction.
Exactly. You can, fine tune the flavor profile
Mm.
or, enhance certain effects by manipulating that balance of cannabinoids and terpenes.
Wow. So you can make it like stronger or more mellow or whatever you want.
Yeah, you can really tailor it to your preferences.
That's pretty wild. It makes me think about like the medical side of things too.
Oh, absolutely.
But could you create like personalized medicine with this?
I think so, yeah. Imagine, being able to create a cannabis therapy that's, tailored to a specific patient,
Okay.
and their condition. You could preserve and enhance the compounds that are most beneficial for them.
So instead of just like a general strain, it's like specific for what you need.
Right. It's like the difference between, taking an over-the-counter medication
Right.
and getting something that's specifically prescribed for you.
That's amazing. Okay, so that's the future, but what about now?
Yeah.
Like, what can people do, at home without like a lab and all that?
Well, even without all the fancy equipment, you can still be more intentional about how you store things.
Okay.
One thing is to just, pay attention to what the grower or the dispensary tells you.
Great.
They often have, recommendations for how to store a particular strain.
Right. So like actually read those little pamphlets.
Exactly, because those details can be really helpful.
Yep.
They can give you insights into the, unique characteristics of that strain and how to preserve them.
Right. So it's like getting advice from the experts.
Exactly. And then, don't be afraid to experiment a little.
Okay.
Try different things, see how it affects the, the aroma, the flavor, the effects. Keep track of it.
So you got to like pay attention and take notes.
Yeah. The more you do that, the better you'll understand what works best for you.
It's like you're becoming a scientist, but for your own cannabis.
Right. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, it is. Okay. But one last thing we've talked about, like long-term storage, weeks, months, even years.
Yeah.
But what about when you just want to, enjoy it fresh?
Ah, good question.
Is there anything you can do to like maximize that?
Well, one of your sources talked about this, and it emphasized the importance of grinding.
Oh, right.
Like how you grind it can actually make a big difference.
So we're talking about like how you physically break down the buds.
Exactly, because you want to do it in a way that preserves those trichomes.
Right, the trichomes.
Yeah, they're like the little resin glands, and they hold most of the cannabinoids and terpenes.
Okay, so you don't want to crush them or anything?
Right, you want to use a good quality grinder, one with sharp teeth,
Really?
so it, cuts cleanly without damaging them.
So not just any old grinder will do.
No, it's worth investing in a good one.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm guessing you should grind it right before you're going to use it.
Absolutely, because as soon as you grind it,
Yeah.
you're exposing more surface area to the air, which means faster degradation.
So fresh is best.
Fresh is definitely best. It's like, grinding coffee beans.
Ah, yeah.
The aroma and flavor are best right after you grind them.
Okay, good analogy. I'm going to pay more attention to my grinder from now on.
I think you'll be happy you did.
All right, well, I think we've covered it all. The science, the techniques, even the philosophy.
We've been on quite a journey.
We have. Thanks for guiding us through it.
Of course, it's been fun.
Yeah, and to our listener, thanks for coming along for the ride.
Thanks for listening.
We hope you learned something new and that you're ready to, become a cannabis storage master.
Definitely.
Remember, it's all about preserving the experience.
Well said.
All right, until next time.
Happy storing.